On behalf of CAI and the IT Metrics and Productivity Institute, we would like to welcome everyone today to this webinar on managing technical debt. Today's webinar has been developed by Ted Theodoropoulos, president of AcroWire. My name is Michael Malutis, and I'm Director of Marketing for CAI. You will be able to hear Ted and myself as panelists, but as a reminder, all other audio lines have been muted. Ted Theodoropoulos is founder and CEO of AcroWire Technology Consulting in Charlotte, North Carolina. Ted has an extensive background in technology and process excellence, including 10 years as a senior vice president at Bank of America as an IT audit and operational risk manager. There, Ted had integrated Six Sigma methodologies into his technology work, earning DFSS Green and Black Belt certifications. This work led to a United States patent, for which he was recognized with the 2007 Best of Six Sigma Award. Prior to joining Bank of America, Ted was a product specialist at Microsoft, providing guidance and support on database technologies, where he became a Microsoft Certified Professional and a Certified Scrum Master. Ted earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Mathematics and an MBA from the University of North Carolina. Ted, thanks for being here today. So at this point, I want to thank all of you for your patience with the opening remarks. Ted, we are ready to begin the presentation. You now have control. Please proceed.
Thanks, Michael. So let's jump right in here and take a look at the outline of what we're going to talk about today. The first thing that we're going to discuss is obviously what technical debt is. We're going to spend a fair amount of time looking at the evolution of the metaphor. Next, we're going to look at opportunities and challenges associated with the metaphor. So technical debt is not a silver bullet, but does provide some opportunities. It also presents some challenges, and we're going to talk through that. We're going to take a look at potential business impacts when your organization suffers from technical debt, what those impacts specifically are. And then we're going to look at a case study, and we're going to pick on Foursquare a little bit, but there were several social media companies who were impacted by the AWS outage last year. We're going to dive into what Foursquare did wrong and what they did right, and evaluate a technical debt scenario. And then finally, we're going to look at what you can do to kind of help manage the technical debt life cycle. It is a iterative process and not a linear one, so we'll kind of look at what that iteration looks like. Okay, so let's talk about what technical debt is and where it came from. The term was first coined by a fellow by the name of Ward Cunningham. And for those of you who've been in software development for some time, probably know who Ward is. Ward invented the wiki in 1994, which is actually a pretty impressive accomplishment considering that's the same year the web browser, for the most part, was introduced. He coined the term in 1992 at a conference, and the way Ward describes technical debt, and Ward's definition is by far the most referenced and widely accepted, but Ward describes technical debt as those internal things that you choose not to do now, but which will impede future development if left undone. And he's obviously talking about internal things with a software development perspective. So if you skip steps in the development process or you take shortcuts, ultimately you're going to be less productive as you try to maintain and enhance the project, is basically what technical debt represents in this context. So where Ward draws the line is he says that technical debt does not include deferred functionality. So what that means is he's taking a very intrinsic view of software quality. And by intrinsic, I mean he's looking from the inside out. So what's behind the scenes? What's underneath the hood? An extrinsic view of quality would be the folks who interact with the system. Okay, and if you leave deferred functionality off the table, that means that the machine may be built flawlessly, but the machine may not be doing exactly what its users need to do. And that's kind of an issue that I'll dig into in a little bit, where Ward and I disagree on exactly what's in scope. So fast forward to, that was 1992, fast forward 14 years to 2006, and Jeff Sutherland, who is also pretty well-known guy in the software field, he's the co-founder of Scrum. He was my Scrum teacher and Scrum mentor. He at a Scrum gathering outlined a few technical debt scenarios, and it's no coincidence that the co-founder of Scrum kind of resurrected this technical debt concept, and that's because the Agile movement is heavily focused on quality. And in order to be Agile, you have to have quality software. So they're big proponents of things like continuous integration and unit testing, so on and so forth. So not much happened between 1992 and 2006. The next kind of event in the evolution of technical debt, Steve McConnell, he's written a number of software books, and he proposed a taxonomy. I would consider this a draft. It's very basic, and you can just tell from the numbering scheme he used here, it was kind of a stream of consciousness type of effort, but it did provide some sort of a basis for us to begin to think about different categories of technical debt, how we may want to categorize them, what sort of debt is good, what sort of debt is bad, etc. 2 years later, Martin Fowler established what he called the technical debt quadrants. And what this matrix really allows you to do is classify technical debt in different buckets. So similar to Steve's taxonomy, this really, the technical debt quadrants really revolve more around how reckless or prudent, deliberate or inadvertent, how well advised technical debt is. So for example, on the left-hand side of the matrix is reckless, on the right is prudent, the top is deliberate, the bottom is inadvertent. So obviously where you don't want to be, reckless, inadvertent debt is by far the least desirable. So the following year, 2010, quite a few things happened in the technical debt world, one of which I don't have highlighted here, but I'll just tell you quickly, is the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon, and that's the #1 computer science school in the world, put together a technical debt workshop at ITSE, the International Conference on Software Engineering. And that happened, I'd say, early June, and got a lot of people's attention, including Gartner. So Gartner later that year released a study where they estimated what they call IT debt to be at $500 billion globally, and that had the potential to grow to $1 trillion by 2015. And there's a couple of things to make note of here. The fact that they used the term IT debt and not technical debt, and these very big, large, round numbers. So IT debt is described a little bit differently than the technical debt definition that Ward used. It's much broader in scope and deals with unsupported platforms, legacy code, etc. And you can tell by the size of these numbers they're a bit of a shot in the dark. But I give Gartner a lot of credit because Gartner, Forrester, etc. These are think tanks that really get the attention of CIOs and of the industry as a whole. So when Gartner came out with this in 2010, it got a lot of people's attention, and things really started to pick up in the technical debt world. The following year, I co-authored a paper called Technical Debt from the Stakeholder Perspective and submitted it to the SEI in 2011. And that paper was accepted. We went to ITSE and presented our definition of technical debt. And what we describe as technical debt is any gap within the technology infrastructure which has a material impact on the required level of quality. So no longer are we focused on just those internal things, as Ward describes them, but also external things. What sort of gaps are affecting the users of our technology, and what sort of productivity hits are they experiencing as a result of those gaps. And in doing so, in defining the term like that, we also had to define what do we mean by stakeholders. So here's kind of a visual representation of the various stakeholders within a technical environment. At the top of this diagram, you have the internal stakeholders, board of directors, risk managers, business execs, and then over here you have the development team. And if you look at, again, at Ward's view, it's kind of the guardrails are up around the development team. From their perspective, that intrinsic quality piece, that's what technical debt represents. We made the argument that you really need a 360-degree view of any issues in the technical environment, and the reason being is they need to be on equal footing when evaluated as to whether or not they're going to be addressed. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the prioritization advantages that the metaphor presents. So when we say quality, what do we mean by software quality? Well, there's a lot of different ways to describe software quality. We chose the ISO 9001 quality model. Basically, these are all the ilities: functionality, reliability, usability, etc. And any gaps that have an impact at the required level for any of these areas is essentially a technical debt, and that's a scenario where a team may consciously borrow against an ideal solution in order to get the app out the door. So an example of this may be, for those of you who've read The Lean Startup, a book I'm quite fond of, the author describes something called a minimum viable product. And a minimum viable product is something that you just get out the door to put in front of a customer to gather feedback, to get validated learning. And you're going to make a lot of compromises putting out an MVP, because the goal is not to build the most polished, scalable solution, but to go out there and acquire feedback. Will customers buy this? Will they use it? Will they like it? Will they actually pay money for it? Those are some of the questions that an MVP can answer. But in getting there, you're going to borrow quite a bit against how you would do it ideally in order to get that out the door. Well, if you don't go back and pay back your technical debt, you're going to increase your risk, and of course you're going to have lower productivity anytime you have to enhance the application. So, for example, if you create a very quick and dirty two-tier solution, tightly coupled between the UI and the data layer, maintenance and enhancement become much more onerous and much more expensive. The application's less scalable. And an interesting phenomenon, something that parallels financial debt really well with technical debt, is that interest compounds. So, that MVP, that less than ideal solution that you put out there to gather feedback, well, if you stick with that as your production solution too long, you're going to end up piling workarounds on top of workarounds. And each one of those workarounds has interest associated with it. So essentially, interest compounds. So it behaves very similar to financial debt. And here we have a spider graph, and I'm always hesitant to include graphs like these or visuals like these because they can be a bit confusing. But this one adds a lot of value, so I'm going to see if we can get through this here. So at the top right, we have a key, and you can see that the application itself is a solid line with a blue shaded interior. Okay, that represents where the application is today on each one of these quality metrics. In the dashed line with the yellow interior, that's what's actually required by the business. Okay, and you can see things line up over here on the reliability side and the usability side and the efficiency side. So they're meeting needs perfectly there. The application is meeting needs perfectly. But if you come over here to maintainability, you can see that the requirements dictate that the application be much more maintainable than where it currently is today. And the shaded area here, that represents technical debt. Okay, and every time you go in and make an enhancement to the application, you're paying interest because it's happening much slower. You're much less productive. So this is an example of a quality deficit. It's pretty obvious, not a lot going on there. Something that's a little bit less intuitive is a quality surplus, because it's hard to think, most people think, I want the most quality humanly possible. Well, the fact of the matter is quality costs money. So let's say, up here at the top in blue, this is an area where the application has exceeded the requirements. So there is more functionality in this application than is actually required. So let's say, for example, your application has some complex password requirements and expiring passwords that isn't really needed. There's no sensitive data. There's very little risk. It's just not a requirement for the application. But the application implements those controls anyway. Well, controls cost money. So anytime somebody locks themselves out of the application and has to send in a request to your help desk, and the help desk person has to authenticate the person, reset the password, etc., those are additional unnecessary costs. You have too much quality. Okay? So ideally, where you want to be is you want as little shaded area as possible. You want your application to fit your requirements perfectly. Obviously, that's not reality, and that's very difficult to achieve, but that's what you want to aim for. So let's look at some of the opportunities and challenges associated with the metaphor. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that technical debt's the silver bullet that's going to solve all your IT challenges, but it can be very useful. One of the key ways that it's useful is in translating the technical into non-technical. And essentially describe, if you go to your stakeholders or your business partners and you're running a project team and you say, dear Mr. Stakeholder, we have a legacy code base that's written in COBOL, and we're having integration challenges with the new social media platforms because, a JSON API is not supported. You're going to get an instant glazed look over the eyes. But if you come to your stakeholders and you say, listen, the way that the application is currently designed costs us $658,000 a year in added maintenance and workarounds, all of a sudden light bulbs start going off. So it's a translation tool from your technical teams to your non-technical teams. And really at the end of the day, and this is a blanket statement which you have to be cautious of, but I can say this with confidence, business leaders always want to build new stuff. Okay, they never want to pay back debt. You're never going to get a business partner that's going to go, hey, can we go refactor that application? I really want to do that. It just doesn't happen because they have goals that are outlined by the organization, and then those goals are whatever, sell new stuff, manage risk more effectively, so on and so forth. Making things efficient underneath the hood may not be the highest priority. So new stuff is always going to outweigh paying back debt. And until you can describe the cost associated with the debt that's on your books, so to speak, and talk about these things in equal terms, you're going to have a challenge. So you need to bring to your business partners apples and apples, not fruit salad. Because when you bring fruit salad, it's real difficult to make a case to get those sorts of things done. Another big opportunity is the transparency that technical debt creates. So business partners and users and even some technical people, they kind of skim across, they're like a kayaker skimming across the ocean. If everything is calm and sunny at the surface, you could have, a 70-mile-an-hour rip current underneath of you, or a volcano getting ready to explode, and they would have no idea. They're just looking from the surface up. So technical debt gives business owners and partners the opportunity to see what's beneath the surface. Because sometimes when you run into a challenge, The bigger problem is beneath the surface. You're just seeing a small effect. And when you describe these challenges in dollars and cents, it really gives an appreciation for the magnitude, and gives kind of a cross-sectional view like we see here. Yeah, you may be seeing some performance challenges when, you're trying to go into your CRM and do a search, but beneath the surface, you've got a whole host of other issues that are actually causing the visible issues up at the top. So let's talk about some challenges. There's currently no conceptual model for technical debt. I've shown you multiple definitions from very well-established folks in the industry: Ward Cunningham, Steve McConnell, Jeff Sutherland, Martin Fowler. And, the fact of the matter is sometimes they don't agree. Sometimes there's overlap. Sometimes the definitions diverge. So what this causes is something I refer to as concept fragmentation. And if you do some searching out on the blogosphere and read about technical debt, you'll find that people have gotten very creative with the different types of technical debt that they talk about. I mean, configuration management debt, refactoring debt, documentation debt. That is my favorite, pairing debt. Like, can you imagine going to a stakeholder and say, yeah, we have pairing debt that we need to address? I mean, even some technical people might not know what that is. In XP, there's a concept called paired programming, and paired programming creates mind share and multiple perspectives on solving a common problem. There's a lot of benefits to doing that. You have, again, that increased mind share. You have better business continuity in case someone leaves or is sick. You've got another person there who was involved in the construction of the code base. And pairing debt refers to the challenges that are created when you don't follow those principles. Again, very obscure, and there needs to be some organization around this. So down at the bottom, this is another example where folks just disagree. We have Uncle Bob Martin, who has a funny name, but he's actually a well-established, he was the original signatory of the Agile Manifesto. Uncle Bob says that CRUFT isn't technical debt, and CRUFT is just a slang term for sloppy code. And the blog post was titled, "A Mess Isn't Technical Debt, It's Just a Mess." That was his blog post. Well, I disagreed with old Uncle Bob. I think that CRUFT is technical debt. And the reason is because you're paying interest on it. Okay, and if the business is paying interest on a sloppy code base, that needs to be managed the same way as anything else that's costing them money. So to say that that doesn't rise to the level of technical debt, because of your ideals, essentially makes the metaphor less effective. So, because of the fragmentation, there's a little bit of an unknown future state, and until a standards organization formally adopts the concept, we're relying on the community to kind of build this concept out and move it forward. And that's created a little bit of uncertainty, and uncertainty impacts adoption. So as a CIO, would I decide to adopt the technical debt metaphor and establish management routines within my business? Would I make that investment when I don't know exactly what technical debt is going to mean in the industry next year? I might not. The good news is that the SEI, Carnegie Mellon, is doing a lot to move it forward. I was on the program committee for this year's workshop, which is in Zurich, Switzerland. I'm not going to be able to make the trek, but reviewed all the papers that went through there, and there is some tremendous research being done by very strong academic institutions to kind of move this concept forward and formalize things a bit. So let's talk quickly, and I'm going to have to pick up a page just a tad here, about the business impacts that technical debt can have on your organization. First and foremost is it can impact your platform stability. The most common manifestation of technical debt is usually fragile or difficult to maintain code. And that scenario has a destabilizing effect on your systems. It decreases your agility and it increases your number of defects. Okay, defects create production issues. Production issues create customer impacts, and which can lead to some very bad things. So technical debt also decreases your ability to be agile and seize market opportunities. All of this ultimately means more fire drills, and fire drills impact morale. And really, at the end of the day, you're going to have lower employee satisfaction when you have a code base that's just full of technical debt, or a technical environment that's full of technical debt. And that's going to make your talent retention challenging. And, you know, as an owner of a technology company, I can tell you that that's the number one challenge, is finding and retaining good people. Another challenge is, another business impact is the cost of change. So there's a very well-established formal thought around how the cost of change goes up naturally over time. There's nothing that can be done. Even if everything stays stable or constant, the cost of change goes up for the most part. And the reason is there's various either integration points that get established, people come and go, documentation gets out of sync with the application, so forth and so on. So a change tomorrow will always cost you more than a change today. And what technical debt does is it dramatically increases the slope of your cost of change curve, dramatically so. And unfortunately, your customer responsiveness curve is inversely proportional to your cost of change curve. So the more it costs you to enhance your application to adapt to market conditions, the less responsive you're going to be able to be to your customer base. And then in extreme examples, but very real scenarios, you can experience technical bankruptcy, because unabated technical debt leads to ballooning interest payments, and eventually they become all-consuming. So if you don't go back and refactor, eventually all of your resources are just going to be focused on keeping the lights on. And when your interest payments exceed your available resources, that's what's known as technical bankruptcy. And I've seen this happen more than one time, luckily from the outside. What happens when a division or a group goes technically bankrupt is people get fired and applications get outsourced. It's not pretty. Okay, so let's pick on Foursquare a little bit here. As I mentioned, last spring there was a very major outage at Amazon Web Services. They had multiple availability zones, or AZs, that were impacted in their Northern Virginia data center. And while the outage was disappointing, Gartner evaluated the SLA language, and Amazon didn't violate their SLA. However, there was extended outages for a number of applications. And, at the end of the day, Amazon is an infrastructure as a service provider. That means that consumers of that service can design applications any way they see fit. And your requirements are what dictates your design. So if your app requires high availability, then you have to accommodate that in your design. And if you fail to do so, then you're introducing risk. And what Foursquare did was they decided to set up their contingency environment in a different availability zone within the same data center here in US East. So what happens when the whole data center goes down? Well, your application goes down because your contingency environment is no longer available. Foursquare, hey, I get it. Full redundancy is not cheap. Startup capital is scarce. Replicating across those availability zones was cheaper. But at the end of the day, they created a requirements gap, and that gap represents technical debt. The principle of that technical debt is the cost to provide the full high availability. So in other words, rather than setting up a contingency in the same data center, which is cheaper, the principle is the cost to set up a contingency environment in one of the other data centers. Okay, and the interest on that technical debt takes the form of the additional risk that Foursquare is taking. So let's actually put some numbers around this. So let's say that based on an optimal design, the risk of an outage is about 0.5%. Because even if you have high availability, you can always mitigate risk, but eliminating risks is nearly impossible. But you've got a very well mitigated risk. Let's say the design shortcuts increase their risk to 4%. Okay, that means that design decision created incremental 3.5% of incremental risk. 4 minus 1/2. If an outage occurs, there's undoubtedly going to be damage to the brand and investor confidence. And the cost associated with that, well, let's just say that's $1 million. By the way, all these numbers are fairly well aligned to reality. There's a few assumptions that go into them, but for argument's sake, let's say they're best estimates. So here we've got our incremental risk of 3.5%. We've got the cost of the event, which is $1 million. If we multiply these two numbers, we can estimate our interest at $35,000, let's say, per year. Is this the only way to go about calculating interest? No, it's not. It's just a very simple but fairly effective way to do it, and it's great for illustration. So Foursquare replicating the way they did cost them $35,000 a year in risk. Now, is that prudent debt or imprudent debt? Well, the answer is it depends. Technical debt can be leveraged responsibly just like a credit card can. If you use your credit card like I do and you make purchases and you pay it back every month and you get the rewards points, and I mean that ultimately that's an advantage. It's also a cash flow advantage because I don't have to shell out that money until the end of the month. The bank has to pay that float. So it can be leveraged responsibly. But let's say that in order to implement the appropriate design, it would cost an additional $100,000 a year. Well, that's a relatively large investment for that $35,000 in risk, right? That would provide us with a 35% ROI, which means that each dollar that we invested, we would get 35 cents back to the business. That's a questionable use of capital. Maybe it's the right decision, maybe not. But from the outside, that looks like prudent debt. It was wise to take that risk. Now, let's look at some assumptions that are more aligned with reality, and that's that there's a cost associated of about $5,000 to replicate across data centers. That's a relatively small investment to eliminate that $35,000 in risk, and that would give you a 700% ROI. So every dollar that you invested will give you $7 back. Okay, so this really looks like imprudent debt. You probably should not assume that debt, given the fact that you can get a 700% ROI by paying it back. So when the outage happened, who did everybody blame? Like, where was the initial focus? Looks like the fonts got skewed here a little bit, but look at these are real headlines. Amazon malfunction raises doubts about cloud computing. Amazon Web Service outage, the end of cloud innocence. These were very reactionary and uninformed articles that just kind of reacted. After people had some time to dissect the issue and understand really the nature of the failure, then the focus shifted a little bit. So it shifted onto Foursquare, for example. And again, not just Foursquare. Reddit went down, Hootsuite went down, Quora went down, a whole bunch of them. But there were also plenty of vendors or application providers that were on Amazon that didn't go down. One of them is Netflix. Guess why they didn't go down? they followed best practices. So anyway, the retrospective focus, you started to see headlines like Web Monkeys down here, lessons from a cloud failure. It's not Amazon, it's you. I posted a blog shortly after the event and said, failing to plan is planning to fail. So again, just poor planning, unmitigated and risks, and taking on imprudent debt. So let's talk about some things that you can do to manage the debt life cycle. As I mentioned in the beginning, the life cycle, it's not a linear path that you take to managing technical debt. This is a life cycle diagram that I came up with, and those of you who are in Six Sigma can see that this mimics DMAIC very closely, and that's not by accident. The first step is defining what technical debt means within your organization. There's many different ways to go about putting up guardrails where you want to draw the limits as to what technical debt is. Once you do that, you need to determine methods to identify where technical debt exists within the organization. Once you do that, you need to measure the magnitude of the technical debt. And then you need to decide whether or not you're going to remediate that debt. Like I said, there's prudent debt and there's imprudent debt. So you need to figure out when and where is appropriate. And then put in some ongoing governance routines to make sure that you don't have unabated technical debt and end up in technical bankruptcy like I discussed earlier. And the reason that this starts all over again is because the definition is going to change over time. You're probably going to go in with a very narrow focus, which makes sense, and evaluate some of the routines that you put in place and the controls and the mechanisms. And over time, as you get more confidence, you'll probably expand the scope of how you define technical debt, and each time you iterate through this process. So let's talk about defining technical debt. It's very important that your stakeholders are able to buy into however you go about defining it. Don't do this in a vacuum. Don't lock yourself up if you're a tech exec with your DRs and come up with something on a blackboard and issue a memo and say, this is how we're doing it. You really need to think about, especially your audit and risk management partners, because those are essentially your enforcement mechanisms within the organization. I spent a lot of time in IT audit, and I can tell you that about the only time businesses self-identify issues is right before they're about to get audited. So you need to make sure that these organizations can buy in, as well as your external auditors. If you're in banking, there's literally dozens, and having some external buy-in will go a long way. Another item to think about when you're defining technical debt is how it aligns to existing frameworks that your organization has adopted. So if you're a COVID shop for your IT risk management, or ITIL, or you have a heavy Six Sigma focus, or you're ISO certified, you've adopted COSO, etc., think about how the definition of technical debt aligns with those frameworks, because it's much easier to generate buy-in if you can point to exactly how the relationship is and how it furthers the cause or penetration of your control objectives for IT in COVID's example. And then, so now we'll jump into identification. And I call this the Jeff Foxworthy test for technical debt. So, and Jeff says you might be a redneck if. Well, here you might have technical debt if you hear your technical team saying things like, don't we have documentation on the file layouts? Or, I thought we had a test for that. This one's my favorite at the bottom. We can't upgrade. No one understands the code. And, these statements usually generate a bit of a chuckle in person. The reason people are laughing is because they've heard them. They've probably heard them recently. So This is just kind of a general litmus test to understanding if your organization may suffer. Now, something a little bit more quantitative than kind of the Jeff Foxworthy approach is you can establish KRIs, which people are familiar with KPIs. KRIs are key risk indicators, and key risk indicators are composite metrics. So, for example, poor code quality. How you might measure code quality is how well is my code commented? How well documented is it either internally or externally? How up to date is that documentation? How many times do we break the build in a given week? All those metrics may roll up into a code quality KRI that you can then track. All this can be automated for the most part. Code coverage, that's another very easily automatable metric. Non-compliance. So how many applications, and this is a trap that I see people fall into all the time, how many people or companies out there have key applications built on platforms that they either don't have the internal resources to support, or they don't have a solid vendor relationship with a company that can come in and provide the support. They're just winging it and hoping something doesn't break. That's a huge leading indicator for technical debt. Some lagging indicators would be service level agreement violations. So how many times have your tech partners failed to meet their committed service levels? How many audits have been failed in the organization? What sort of data quality issues? These are lagging indicators, but very indicative of technical debt scenarios. And then once you've identified where technical debt is, it's time to measure what's the magnitude of the technical debt. And there's a formulaic approach to this. Looks like a complicated formula. It's actually drop dead simple. What this is inside the parentheses, 1 to n. N is the number of resources needed to address the gap. And again, this is just calculating principle. So what's the number? Let's say it's 10. What's the average hourly rate? How many hours are needed? And then what other additional costs? That kind of gives you your human capital cost. And then here you have hardware costs, software licenses, and then any migration and implementation expenses. That's kind of how you calculate principal. Calculating interest is all over the board. Maybe Michael will have me back and we can talk about some different ways to calculate interest. We went through a risk-based approach a few minutes ago. A productivity-based evaluation of technical debt is a little bit more difficult. So, in other words, saying, okay, if I had the optimal design here, this enhancement would take me 1 hour to complete. But since I have this spaghetti code, it's going to take me 8 hours. Well, your interest is 7 hours times the hourly rate of the resource that has to make the change. To do that on a kind of a broad scale is a bit challenging, so you have to ultimately, you can't be too granular, or you can, it's just going to take you a long time to calculate. Okay, and then once you've measured your technical debt, you need to figure out where to remediate. And again, this goes back to prioritization. All of a sudden, now that your debt is expressed in dollars and cents, you've got a level playing field. You're no longer bringing your business partners fruit salad. You're bringing them apples to apples. And the common basis here is ROI. So, when your business partner says, we really need that new CRM feature, it's going to get us an ROI of 150%, and then you can show them this debt payback initiative that's going to give them 700%, I think they're going to be more receptive to that. And if they're not, then maybe you need to get a steering committee or somebody involved. But again, apples to apples will really help the prioritization process. And then finally, governance. And governance could be its own webinar in and of itself. Something that I'm an advocate of, and you can find, I've blogged about this topic extensively, technical debt and governance. You can go to blog.acrowire.com and find a lot more detail than I present here. But here are some ideas just to kind of get the wheels turning a little bit. So just like a business has a financial capital structure, that is, you can have debt and equity to finance your business. What determines the appropriate debt to equity ratio? Part of that is your free cash flow. So in the same concepts apply in the technical debt space. Free cash flow in the technical debt space is essentially your resources, your IT resources, and their free capacity. If you have a highly volatile free cash flow, you're gonna have to have a much lower debt to equity ratio. And the reason is because if you're at a low point in your available free cash flow and you've got to make an interest payment and you can't make that interest payment because you don't have the cash flow, guess what? You go into bankruptcy. And that's the same concept that applies in the financial world. So there's a lot of, this metaphor really does line up well with the financial models. So once you've determined the appropriate debt to equity ratio, it's important to monitor that technical balance sheet. And to do that, you're going to need to establish a debt registration database. And this isn't pie in the sky stuff. I can tell you I've seen this firsthand, and it's a game changer. There are mature organizations. They may not call it debt registration database. You know, the last place I consulted with who implemented something like this, they called it a centralized risk assessment tracking tool. Had a terrible name. It was called IRAT. But anyway, these things are real. This isn't pie in the sky, ivory tower stuff. Companies are really doing this. And then something else you can do is establish credit limits for high risk areas. So just like you don't let your 16-year-old kid run off with your gold card with a $40,000 limit, you also don't let high risk areas of your business, like if you're in banking, your online banking group would be a very high risk area. You give them a very low credit limit for how much debt they can accrue. Yeah, you need to, I've been asked the question, well, what is the appropriate level of technical debt? That's a very difficult question to just give a blanket answer to, but I can give you a way to think about it. It's kind of like a body fat percentage. So a certain amount of body fat percentage is healthy and it is mandatory. Too much, and you start to have negative health effects. Too little, and the same thing applies. So that's a parallel with technical debt. If you have too much, you're going to experience all the impacts that I described earlier. Too little means that you're not taking enough risk in your business, because you should be experimenting and you should be releasing MVPs. And if you're not doing that, then you're missing opportunities. So establish credit limits for the high-risk areas, and maybe you get credit limits for low-risk areas too. They just get a higher limit. And then finally, foster a risk management culture within your organization. I mean, I think we all learned lessons from the investment banking collapse. I thought we learned lessons back in the early 2000s with WorldCom and Global Crossing, but apparently we didn't. So establishing a risk management culture, the reason that I made a comment earlier that businesses only self-identify issues when they know an audit's coming. And why is that? The reason is because they're not rewarded for it. In fact, they're usually punished for it. Their superiors are going, what, you've got this problem, that's going to potentially impact our business? What were you thinking? That's not a risk management culture. You really need to establish that and reward people for raising their hand and saying, hey, I've got a problem here. I want to have it registered in our central database and have it prioritized by the steering committee. And that's all we have for this, the prepared slides. Michael, if we want to open this up to questions, I'll be glad to take some.
Thank you, Ted. If you have questions for Ted at this point, you can type them into the Q&A interface. It's at the top of your screen. We'll take all the questions that come in. I'm going to give all of you a chance to formulate and submit some questions, and while we wait for you to do that, I just want to take a few slides to tell you about some of the additional educational opportunities that we have planned throughout the rest of the year. If you're not familiar with us, these webinars are coordinated by the IT Metrics and Productivity Institute, which is an organization that was created by CAI. It's fully funded and fully supported by CAI, and it was created specifically to promote best practices education in IT and software. To this end, we established a clearinghouse site for best practices education on the Internet. That site is ITMPI.org. We also have an educational newsletter at ITMPI.org/subscribe. You can subscribe to that for free. And, of course, we do free educational webinars every week of the year with IT leaders. You can find out all about the 2012 schedule. We have 100 or so webinars scheduled for this year, and you can read about them and also register for them by going to itmpi.org/webinars. We also have a vast archive of historical webinar recordings, over 500, that are posted on our main archive site at itmpi.org/library. All of these webinars, live and recorded, are accredited by the PMI with PDUs. You can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/ITMPI, and you can join now our rapidly growing network of IT practitioners and executives and thought leaders from around the world on LinkedIn by simply going to itmpi.org/LinkedIn. And of course, we do conference events throughout the world, actually, the United States and around the world every year. We have a lot of events coming up in the spring of this year and also later on in the fall. Just on the immediate horizon, we have an event in Albany, New York, which is in a couple of weeks. You can read about that, the main event center. We have a big event coming up on June 5th in Pittsburgh as well. But there's lots of luncheon learning sessions and full-day conferences and half-day conferences. We have stuff coming up in Singapore in the fall and London, and lots of opportunities to network and to expand your educational horizons. So we do have plenty of questions waiting at this point in time. First question, Ted, is lack of technical talent also a debt?
That's an interesting question, and the answer is the actual lack of talent itself isn't technical debt, but the lack of technical talent will certainly create debt. So by the way that, even my broad definition of technical debt defines the concept, the gap has to exist in the technical environment, right? So people don't exactly, they're not in the technical environment, but absolutely, the lack of technical talent will undoubtedly head you down a path that will be laden with technical debt.
Thanks, Ted. Next question. How would you suggest bringing this concept up if your client organization falls very low in the maturity model?
And that's a great question. And I think that's exactly, technical debt is exactly the tool that you need, because even the least mature organization understands dollars and cents. So you need technical debt more in those conversations than you do with a highly mature organization, because concepts, such as quality and continuous integration and code coverage, et cetera, don't resonate well with companies that are kind of lower on that maturity spectrum. Everybody understands dollars and cents, so I think that is a more important tool than ever in those types of scenarios.
Thanks, Ted. Next question. I work in an organization that has a 25-year-old mainframe COBOL applications that are supported by a very small staff of EEs that are eligible to retire in 3 to 5 years. Since finding an experienced COBOL developer to come in and help manage technical debt, what other suggestions do you have to help an organization address the problem?
Yeah, and that's, you might have saw on that concept fragmentation slide, there's something there called platform experience debt, and that's kind of what's being described here. That is a very tough challenge, and it's not always realistic to say, just re-platform the solution. Sometimes that's just not possible. You're kind of in a rock and a hard place. So what I would do in that scenario is I would actually calculate the risk that's being taken. So in other words, what happens, what would be the dollars and cents impact if at the end of these 3 to 5 years when these folks retire and you can't replace them, what sort of financial impact could you be facing? And then go to the stakeholders with that information in your hand. It doesn't have to be perfect, to give them some financial sense, because the reason that COBOL applications are still around is because mainframes are still doing a lot of the heavy lifting in big organizations, especially financial and government organizations. So moving away from that is a huge investment, so they're not going to do it until they have to. So if you present a sound financial argument for at least getting that conversation going, then that's the place to start. But I understand your dilemma. I've seen this scenario firsthand, and it is challenging.
Thanks, Ted. Next question. Actually, I'm having some problems with. Here we go. Could you define, Ted, what software maintenance, how software maintenance and enhancements relate to technical debt?
So, yeah, I mean, they contribute, software maintenance and enhancement can contribute to technical debt depending on, are there sound methodologies in place that help define those activities? There's something called ALM, Application Lifecycle Management. Are you following best practices when going about enhancing and maintaining the application? Are you creating the appropriate documentation and artifacts throughout the process? If the answer to those questions is no, you're probably actually creating debt. Your methodology and process and controls that you have put in place, code reviews, etc., all those things reduce the amount of debt. So there's a very strong relationship between your application lifecycle management and the amount of technical debt that's likely has accrued within your organization.
Thanks, Ted. Does the MVP solution option encounter the same degree of debt if it exists within the context of incremental delivery? In other words, if it is planned to be only part of the final solution, and as part of such a plan, doesn't the revenue from the MVP and its incremental extension offset the cost of technical debt?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So there is when evaluating your technical debt, not all technical debt has to be paid back. Okay, so in other words, if you are experimenting with a feature and you implement you take an MVP approach and just do enough to get it out the door, and you get a negative reaction or not a positive enough reaction to this particular feature to implement it full bore, then guess what? That debt is never going to have to be paid back. You're going to trim that out of the code base and you're going to move on. So again, technical debt is a way to do things like implement an MVP, and there is a certain amount of uncertainty as to whether or not you'll have to pay that back. What you have to do, I mean, you can look at case studies like Twitter, for example. Twitter made a lot of architectural compromises when it initially designed that solution, and I think it was at the South by Southwest convention in 05, 06. It just completely fell on its face, and you can't entirely blame Twitter for that because they had no idea of the level of demand. But at some point, you have to do some projections and say, you know what, this feature looks like it's going to stay in production, and we're going to do some projections and see what our projected use rate is, and then based on that, we're going to do some load testing and see if our current architecture can handle it. And if that answer to that question is no, then you need to make some changes. So, great question about MVP. That's a somewhat popular approach these days, and I think we may want to have a webinar just to talk through MVP and technical debt.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, everybody, for the questions. If you have any additional questions in the days or weeks ahead, you can always reach Ted directly. His email address is on the screen. It is ted@acrowire.com. That's ACROWIRE. If anybody has any questions for me or suggestions for future webinar content, you can always reach me at michael_malutis@compay.com. However, at this point, we are ready to conclude today's webcast. So on behalf of CAI and AcroWire and the ITMPI, Ted and I both would like to thank all of you for joining us today. We do hope to see all of you again at future webinar events. We are at this point formally dismissed. Thanks, Ted, for being here.
Thank you.